Welcome to Zealots of the Gate, a podcast of Comment Magazine. I'm Matthew Kaming.
I'm Shadi Hamid.
Together we research politics, religion, and the future of democracy at Fuller Seminary's Mao Institute of Faith and Public Life.
We are writing a book together. This podcast represents an informal space where we can talk about how to live with deep difference. Thanks so much for joining us.
Friends, welcome back. It's good to have you. Just a reminder, please do, if you are listening, subscribe, share. Thanks for joining us. Shadi, would you please invite our very special guest?
Yeah, so I'm really excited about today. We've talked about having Mustafa Akyol on the pod for quite some time, and now it's finally happening.
I feel like it's been a year we've been wanting to have him on.
Yeah, we talk about you all the time, Mustafa.
Honored to hear that, hopefully in a good way.
Yeah. So Mustafa is a senior fellow at the Cato Institute. I'm a little bit biased, but I'd say he's probably one of the most interesting and original Muslim thinkers writing today. And I think it's fair to say, too, Mustafa, that you're one of the most prominent advocates of a kind of Islamic liberalism, if I can use that phrase, but feel free to push back when we get into that later if you don't love that. Mustafa is author of many books. His previous book, which is quite excellent and I would highly recommend to viewers and listeners, is titled Reopening Muslim Minds, A Return to Reason, Freedom, and Tolerance. But what we'll focus on today is his new book, which also has a pretty compelling title. It's called The Islamic Moses, How the Prophet Inspired Jews and Muslims to Flourish Together and Change the World. And it's also worth noting that you have another previous book called The Islamic Jesus. So it seems like you're going for a little pattern here. But I'll just say about this new book, I really do feel like it's, a monumental accomplishment. I think I'm comfortable saying that. It feels big to me. There's nothing quite like it. It's also a decidedly unfashionable argument, which to me makes it, actually more appealing. So let's I want to get into the unfashionability of the argument and why I say that, but maybe just to get us warmed up, could you describe what kind of Muslim you are and what kind of Islam you believe in and would like more Muslims to follow? Because you're someone who is really engaged on this question of Islam and liberalism and whether Islam can be liberal, whether it should be liberal. And maybe you can just lay out a little bit what your starting assumptions are there.
Yeah. In terms of like the larger project of a Muslim case for democracy, for reason, for liberty, which seems to be in many ways your life's work. If you could tell us just a little bit about that larger context, I think that'd be great.
Well, thank you so much, Matthew and Shadi. This is great. Thank you for your kind words. I've written a lot about Islam and liberalism. And by liberalism, I mean not the particularly, center-left political trend in America, but the classical liberal tradition, the idea of a limited government, equal rights under the law, free speech, freedom of expression, freedom of religion, and so on, and free markets, and so on and so forth. I'm coming from Turkey and therefore actually the Ottoman tradition. And when you're looking at the world from that perspective, it's not uncommon to try to link Islam and liberalism. This was a serious intellectual effort in the late Ottoman Empire. Ottoman intellectuals like Namık Kemal and the young Ottomans, they were the ones that actually admired a lot of things they saw in Europe at the time. And they thought this is also compatible with Islam. That's why they spearheaded a constitutional government in the Ottoman Empire, the Ottoman Constitution of 1876, which gave equal rights to all Ottoman citizens, unlike the medieval Islamic system where Muslims were tolerant but superior. So politically, the idea of a limited government, equal rights, free markets, freedom of expression, freedom of religion, these values, I believe in these values. I think this is the best political formula that mankind has ever, built in centuries. There could be better ones in the future too. Now, a lot of Muslims will say, well, we don't want to get into this discussion because Islam has its own system, right? They would not They would say there's a khilafah, there's sharia that should rule the land. I see what they call as the Islamic system as the historical experience of Muslims. Like, I don't think Islam as a religion requires a khilafah or caliphate. Of course, this is a big discussion in itself, but I agree with people like Ali Abdel Razak in Egypt or Said Bey in Turkey, which made this argument a century ago. I do believe Islam has values that certainly can and should inform political action, but I don't think they offer a governmental model.
Yeah, longtime listeners will remember that we did have an episode on the caliphate, and we had a really spirited discussion about what a modern caliphate might look like.
I know, yeah. I mean, there are scholars who are working on this. Obamir Anjum has written about that.
Yeah, he's the one who we had on, actually.
Yeah, we had a heated debate with Obamir on these issues too. But I respect his scholarship. Of course, I don't share some of his perspectives. I think today across the Muslim world, there is a yearning for an Islamic alternative of governance, Islamic state. And there should be an Islamic economy, there should be Islamic politics, there should be Islamic Coca-Cola, or I mean, what anything. I mean, I'm not joking, there was a Mecca-Cola in the UK. But I think rather Islam's values are universal values, discoverable by reason. They precede revelation, so I'm getting into theological
this
territory
is dangerous
here.
territory.
Yeah, here we go.
Revelation confirms those values, but those values are universal: justice, fairness, security, coexistence, and life, and you can name the values of Islam. So I think these values have been articulated. I mean, people ask me, like, why Muslims wanted a khilafah for 14 centuries. They lived under it. Well, what's the alternative? I mean, in medieval times, if I was living in 10 centuries ago, I would want to live under an Islamic caliphate and nothing else. What's the alternative? The alternative are the Mongols that come and slaughter you and the Crusaders that come and slaughter you. There was no idea of a government that treats its citizens equally regardless of religion, and they would give them full religious rights, right? So politics is an evolving realm for me. Islam's values are universal, but those values can be articulated in different political settings. And I think the liberal formula that is challenged by a lot of people these days, from right and left, and I think still the best political invention.
Okay. Well, so there's a lot there in your response, and we'll get back to some of these questions around reason and rationality later. But maybe now is a good point to get into the key argument of your new book. Again, it's called The Islamic Moses, and we'll include a link to the book in the show notes for those of you who want to get a copy or read. So you make I think, a pretty controversial argument, but one that is, we don't hear it all that much these days. But if I can maybe sum up part of it, that in the U.S., we talk a lot about a Judeo-Christian tradition. But your argument is that the Judeo-Islamic tradition is in some ways stronger and more historically grounded. That it's actually a relatively recent invention, and I would say probably mostly in the U.S., to construct a narrative of a Judeo-Christian tradition. And that if you go back many, many centuries, it was actually Judaism and Islam that had much more common affinities. And you talk about a number of them. One is the more legalistic orientation of Islam and Judaism in contrast to Christianity, which you argue is less focused on the law or upholding traditional Old Testament laws and so forth. But maybe just start us off with why you think it's important to argue for a Judeo-Islamic tradition. Obviously, this comes at an interesting time for this point, because Jews and Muslims are, let's say, not to maybe oversimplify matters, not getting along as well as they did perhaps a few years ago. Obviously, the Gaza war has raised tensions among these two communities. But you wrote most of your book before October 7th and before the Gaza war. And then you were sort of thrust into this new situation where you're arguing for something that seems as far away as ever.
Yeah, and Mustafa, if I could just throw out like my interpretation here of your sort of telling of the Judeo-Islamic tradition, it seems to me there's like three movements going on within your within your argument or your formulation of it. Is one is Judaism and Islam share a lot of similarities theologically, ethically, politically. There's a lot of sort of legal theological similarities between Judaism and Islam. You're also saying that they influenced one another throughout history. And you tell the story of the different ways in which Judaism and Islam have influenced one another. And then there's almost sort of a sense of dependence where the two traditions have helped one another, or protected one another, or enriched one another. And I see those are distinct things, but I see those things going on in your argument. So anyways, yeah, if you could just kind of outline for us what you mean by this Judeo-Islamic tradition, and yeah, maybe a little bit of what you hope to accomplish by telling the story. And just to reiterate, I think as well, this is a really important and needed argument, and the relative silence on it is quite stunning. Like after reading the book, I'm like, why don't we talk about this more?
Well, guys, first of all, thank you for all the good things you said about the book. It's meaningful to hear that from you.
I have some critical stuff coming, though.
We're getting there.
That is even better.
It's coming.
Yeah.
We're just warming you up right now.
Praise is good. Criticism is even better. To pick up on your motto, Shadi, and wisdom of the crowds. Actually, the original title I suggested to my publisher at St. Martin's Press was The Judeo-Islamic Tradition, A Forgotten Story, right? But we stick with Islamic Moses because I have a book called Islamic Jesus, which did well, so this is a sequel to it. And the Islamic Moses is the beginning of the story. That's why, the subtitle says How the Prophet Inspired. So in the book, when you open, first you learn about why in the whole Quran, the most dominant figure by far is Moses, right? The Quran, you read the Quran, it begins with the story of a friend of mine who wants a copy of the Quran, a translation from me, and he comes back and says, I was expecting to learn about Muhammad. All I learned about is Moses. And I says, yeah, there's a reason for it. And I begin with that story. And I tell the Quranic story of Moses in the first chapter. Then I show why Moses was so dominant figure for the scripture of Islam. And then I say, because he was the role model for Prophet Muhammad. And then I explain what that role model means. It's about saving your believers from persecution with an exodus of some sort we call hijrah. But then you also start to build a presence, right? A military presence, and you conquer somewhere, the conquest of Canaan and the conquest of Mecca and, let's say, Western Arabia in this sense, which also set Islam on a certain historical trajectory. Muslims say, of course, as we believe, it came from divine revelation. But if you look at it from a historical perspective, it's a major expansion of Judaism to non-Jewish peoples. There has been historians who called Islam Judaism for Gentiles. I quote them in the book. Actually, Sheikh Hamza Yusuf said that as an Islamic scholar. And I said, wow, that's very interesting. You have that quote. Why is that? Because we know that Christianity also came out of Judaism in some sense, but Christianity added new things. One was the whole doctrine of Trinity, the idea of a divine Messiah, which didn't exist in Judaism, which created a theological gap. And also Christianity was based on the abandonment of the Mosaic law in many ways. Islam just sticked with the Jewish precedent in both of those issues, a very staunch monotheism, and uncomplicated by, let's say, arguments of Trinity, and a legalistic tradition. That's why the Halakha and Sharia are very similar traditions. Now, people would be surprised to hear this today because when they hear about the Sharia, they know the Taliban, they know the Iranian regime, they think of stoning and all that. Well, the Halakha is the penal code of the halakha is not implemented anymore for 2,000 years for very interesting reason that Judaism didn't have a state of its own. But actually these are similar traditions. That's why discussions or conversations about the halakha in the Jewish tradition are very interesting from an Islamic perspective, because it's similar to our discussions about the Sharia. How much of it is historical? How much of it is to be implemented literally, and so on and so forth. So come back to the question, I'm telling this Judeo-Islamic tradition story at a time when maybe this is the last thing people want to hear, right? There are a lot of anxiety over the war in Gaza, which has been pretty traumatizing for me too, I should say, to watch. There's great distrust among Muslims towards Judaism, Israel, the broad, maybe the Jewish presence in the world. And among Jewish people, there's great anxiety about, of course, radicals, Hamas and their supporters and all that. So there is it's a time of tension, but maybe there's something good in it that the book is coming out at this time, which is reflected in the book. I mean, I gave this book in the epilogue, I say to my publisher, hoping that it will add to peace in the Middle East. And a week later, I woke up to October 7 and the horrors of that. I tried to address it a little bit in the end of the book as well. So yeah, at a time of, I think, bitter conflict and great tension, I'm trying to say, hey, look, Jews and Muslims, let's understand that we have very similar religions. We were actually pretty good together for many centuries. And with that inspiration, maybe we can try to still hope for peace in the Middle East as well.
And I think, one of your arguments that stood out to me is that Judaism wouldn't be Judaism if it wasn't for Islam. That Judaism developed as a theological tradition under Muslim rule. And you quote Bernard Lewis, who says this, the quote here is, "The emergence of a Jewish theology took place almost entirely in Islamic lands." And that, can you maybe just say a little bit more about that? How dependent was Judaism on Islam?
First of all, Islam historically saved many Jewish people from persecution and even maybe being from being destroyed, because when Islam came into the world scene, Christianity was not today's liberal Christianity. You had the Byzantine Empire, which had pretty harsh laws against Jews. You had the Visigoths in Spain, which were deeply, deeply oppressive, brutally oppressive on the Jewish people in Spain. And Muslims came out with an idea that, we conquer people, and if they're people of the book, Jews and Christians, we take an extra tax from them, and there are some limitations, but we allow them to practice their religion, which was a very good deal for the Jewish people. And that's why Islamic conquest, and I go through them gradually, one by one, Islamic conquest in Syria and Palestine and then North Africa and Spain were welcomed by Jewish communities, even actively assisted by the Jewish communities, especially we see that in Spain. And I go through the Israeli sources and Jewish sources and all that. When Muslims conquered Jerusalem from the Byzantine Empire, in 638, during the time of Caliph Umar, the second caliph, successor of Prophet Muhammad. This was a blessing for the Jews because the Byzantines had banished Jews, the Romans had banished Jews from Jerusalem for centuries, and Islam brought them back into Jerusalem. That's the beginning of the Jewish quarter in the Old City. I go through these historical episodes. The Ottoman Empire saved Jews when they were forced to either convert to Christianity or expelled in Spain during the end of the Reconquista, the time of Christopher Columbus. So historically, there are many cases that Islamic empires came as a blessing to Jews. People will say, oh, they were not equal. And I'm not saying, they were equal. And I prefer the liberal equality under the law, which ultimately the Ottoman Empire reached, by the way, at the 19th century, at the end of the 19th century. But for its time, I think historically we should look at things not with presentism, but understanding its historical context. Now, also when Jewish people were under Islamic rule, there were some bad periods too, and I mentioned them as well. But generally, Jews engage with the Islamic tradition. Islam had more people, more institutions, and more money, and more things, and more scholars, and all that. And the Jewish tradition were influenced deeply from the Islamic tradition on two areas. One is theology. The other one is philosophy. On theology, as Bernard Lewis says, and a few other Jewish scholars also made that point, the Jewish theology had certain giant big names like Saadia Gaon and later Maimonides. They developed theological ideas with Islamic influence. And I also show an irony there. They were very influenced by the Mu'tazila, which are known the rationalist theologians in Islam, which later in Islam actually became a little bit marginalized. But their influence actually became bigger on Judaism. And it is an historical irony that today we have some Mu'tazila texts that didn't survive in Arabic, but survive in Hebrew. And now there's an effort to translate them, which I also mentioned in the book. The second influence was philosophy, Greek philosophy. Both Islam and Judaism are religions based on divine revelation. Muslims and Jews didn't think that they have any reason to study Aristotle or Plato or Galen or all these infidel, Greek thinkers. But at some point, you see in Islamic civilization, in especially Abbasid times in Iraq, in these cosmopolitan cities of the time, Muslims beginning to get interested in Greek philosophy, translating these books into Arabic, which actually brought Greek tradition, Greek philosophy to world heritage. And from that on, it went through Spain to Europe. Jews also were very influenced by this. And that's why Jewish philosophy also emerged with Islamic influence. And again, an irony that we have some books of Ibn Rushd, the greatest Aristotelian philosopher in Islam of the Middle Ages. Some people would define him as probably the greatest Islamic intellectual that influenced world history, Averroes, known in Latin. We have a dozen of his books, not in Arabic, but in Hebrew translations today. And those Hebrew translations have been translated into English recently. And from those texts, we learn more about the Ibn Rushd today, which shows Judaism learned a lot from Islam, but also as Muslims, we owe to Jews that they kept some of our texts, important texts that we ourselves lost. And why did that happen is also an interesting question.
So Mustafa, along those lines, I'd love for you to share, this is my last softball, and then I'm going to start pushing a little bit.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to those, yes.
So I'd love to hear just a little bit about your own process of discovery as you were working on the book in terms of how did your mind change about Judaism in and through your research and your work on this book? And maybe what sorts of gratitude might you have for the Jewish people, the Jewish tradition, that maybe you didn't have before you worked on this book?
Well, if you're asking for my own interest in this issue, again, it goes to my maybe Turkish and Ottoman background.
No, I think it's less interest. It's more of like, how has your mind changed? And maybe like, what are some things that you're grateful for? That you learned in and through your research, that you're like, man, Muslims should be more grateful to Jews for this, or Muslims really need to know this about Judaism, that they might respect and honor this about it.
I was fascinated by the discussions within Judaism about the halakha, their Sharia, and how much reason plays in reinterpreting that. There's a chapter, the Jewish Haskalah and the Islamic Enlightenment. I look into how before the modern era, Jews were not a part of Europe in the sense that they were living there, but in ghettos and as closed societies. But in the 18th century, you have this Haskalah or Jewish Enlightenment movement where people like Moses Mendelssohn, which I write a lot about in that chapter, come out and say, hey, we Jews should be a part of society. They're giving us equal citizenship right now. at this time, it was not even fully realized yet, but he was trying to work for it. Let's just study all these secular sciences. I mean, a lot of Jews were actually not interested in secular sciences. So he opened up Jewish minds to the secular universal reality out there, thanks to the liberal order that was beginning to arise. But then he called on Jews to rethink some issues in their tradition. Judaism was accused at the time to be a legalistic religion, which began with a theocracy. It's a dangerous religion. That's how some Enlightenment figures look at Judaism, which is very similar to how they look at Islam today. I mean, not the same people, but let's say their descendants. And I show how Moses Mendelssohn, as the John Locke of the Jews, as some people have called it, reinterpreted certain things in Judaism in a way that it would make it compatible with a liberal society, a coercion-free Judaism, I can say. Now, those are very interesting for me because as a Muslim, these are the issues we're discussing today. That's why I go back and forth between the Jewish Enlightenment and Islamic history. Then, as an Ottoman, that's really probably my most important identity. I feel grateful to the Jewish people for always standing up with the Ottomans. And there's a chapter I write about how the Jewish lobby in Britain was so pro-Ottoman against when the Ottoman Empire was fighting Russia for its own survival, and Russia was coming after the Ottomans. I mean, these are chapters that people forgot. What most people remember is that, the Ottoman Empire was collapsing, and then came Zionism and the British. Well, that's just the last maybe 10 years. But there's a long history of Jewish people also appreciating the Islamic civilization. And I appreciate the good Orientalists that I discuss in the book. These were 19th century Jewish German scholars of Islam who, at a time when Islam was seen quite negatively in Europe, brought a much more fair and, I would say, sympathetic outlook on Islam to Western literature. People, again, recall the bad Orientalists, the biased ones, but they were that's why I have a chapter, the good Orientalists. So I talk about these Jewish contributions to Islamic societies, Islamic civilization a lot, and I'm saying we can even have more of that if we engage in a conversation.
Okay, now I also want to push a bit because I think some of your critics might say that what you find most appealing about Judaism is basically that in some sense you want Islam to become more like what Judaism became, that insofar as Judaism emphasized reason, rationality, non-coercion, it moved away from the role of the state and focused on the role of individuals and the role of the community because there was no Jewish state, that deep down this project for you is really, it could be seen as using Judaism to push Islam in a different direction, in a liberal direction. That, as you've said, you want Islam to be more open to liberalism. Perhaps you even want Islam to be liberalized. I don't know if that's how you would put it exactly. So how would you address that fear? Because certainly for some people, it's a fear that they don't want Islam to follow the same path that Jewish theology did, because they might say that, well, look at what happened. You had the Jewish Enlightenment, then you have the secularization of Jewish identity, especially in the U.S. You have a movement away from orthodoxy towards Reform Judaism, which de-emphasizes Jewish law considerably, so much so that you might even say that Jewish law doesn't really play much of a role in Reform Judaism. That is not a very encouraging model for Muslims who want to hold on to what makes Islam distinctive. They might say that we actually like that Islam is resistant to secularization. We like that Islam plays an outsized role in public life. We like that Islam has something to say about governmental affairs, and it's not just a question of individual piety or communal organization. So they might see your book as a cautionary tale, an example of what not to do and of what not to pursue.
Yeah, I mean, to be sloppy about it, to just say that, the Jewish minority in the West has in many ways assimilated into modern liberal life, and it has lost its religious distinctives, its religious strangeness, and has capitulated to a Western rationalism.
And also built a lot of influence over it too. So I would see it as that way too. Now, I told this your point. And yes, do I want Islam to go to a more liberal direction? Definitely. That's my whole work is about. But let me specify what I mean by liberalism here. It's a dirty word in the Muslim world today. And when you say, I want Muslims to be liberal, they would say, oh, you don't want them to pray. You don't want them to fast in Ramadan. You want them to, do cocaine parties or something like that. No, what I mean is I want Muslims to be as observant that they would want as pious people. I just don't want them to have political systems that enforce this on people. So we should give up. So my liberalism is very political in the sense that it's about non-coercion in the religion. So I'm not asking for Muslims to give up their piety. It's just piety should not be enforced. And if you don't do that in any given Muslim society or community, there will be some people who are more pious. There will be people who are kind of pious a little bit, but also the other way too. There will be some people who are not observant at all. And the pious people should do preaching and other civil society activism and persuasion and all that to keep the tradition alive. But that's normal. That's the way things are. And when you enforce piety, as we see in Iran, as we now see in Afghanistan, as we've seen in Saudi Arabia for long, it actually even is counterproductive in the modern world because this is not your medieval world anymore. People know that they have options.
Yes, but isn't this sort of the modern Enlightenment thing?
Yeah.
Which is essentially to make religion a private, personal, spiritual practice, and then everything else belongs to secularism?
Yeah, I mean, what if Islam isn't meant to be a private
I didn't say
individual-
private. I didn't say private. I said non-coerced. I'm
Okay,
not
we're
saying,
basically like, I still
I'm not-
want them to pray, but other than, personal piety.
I want them to pray because they want to pray because they believe in God and they think this is my religious obligation. I think that's a healthier religiosity than praying because there is a religion police force checking whether you're praying or not, which is the case in Afghanistan today.
Okay, but that's a bit of a binary. I mean, obviously, we can look at the extreme examples of Iran and Afghanistan, and I think the vast majority of reasonable people like us are going to say, of course, that's terrible. But there is something in between where there is a more real public expression of Islam, that it plays some role in government.
Yeah.
And people can disagree on what that looks like. But what you seem to be suggesting here is a sort of secular outlook, a separation, if you will, to some degree.
Yeah. I want a secular outlook in the sense that actually, again, I'll tell you, despite all its political problems, you cannot criticize the president and know that whether you'll be safe or not. But Turkey is actually not a bad model for Muslim majority societies in the sense that it's a secular republic for 100 years. It went too secular and oppressively secular, and I was critical of that. But today, there's no Sharia in the legal system. Religion is very vibrant. You have mosques everywhere. People, and it influences politics too. I'm not against religion influencing politics. I'm against religion using the state as a coercive mechanism. So Abdullah Naim makes a distinction between we have to separate Islam from the state. It doesn't mean we have to separate Islam from politics. You can inform politics. So there are, Rashid Ghanouchi has certain perspectives on this I value a lot. So I'm not saying Islam as a religion should have no say on world affairs or public issues. Islam as a religion will inform and motivate its believers, and that's totally normal and fine, and it's a contribution in many ways. But when it goes, it is giving up coercive power in the name of Islam. That's how I define it.
But what you call coercion, other Muslims might just say that, hey, we want Sharia to play some role in the legal system. We don't want the Turkish example that you just mentioned where Sharia is essentially removed from having any kind of legal force. And that brings us back to the changes that happened to Jewish law over time. And maybe you could say a little bit more about that. But, it's really interesting to look at how not, as you've alluded to, not having a state had such a profound influence on the evolution of Judaism and Jewish thought. Then when you don't have a state for many, many centuries, and this is really since the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 AD, Jews did not have a state to rule, and that meant they had to kind of focus on individual piety and communal obligations and so forth. And Jewish law it became something other than what it was prior. So there's a really important lesson here on the importance of context, that context can change law over time. And that you can imagine a situation where if there were no distinctly Muslim or Islamic states, that maybe Muslims would start to see the law in a different way. But ultimately, I think that's the rub, that many Muslims would see this as a not positive development. And it's not just me claiming that many Muslims would see it this way. Most of the polling we have in Muslim majority countries in the Middle East and South and Southeast Asia make very clear that very large majorities of Muslims don't want Sharia to be removed from the legal system. So if that's what you find most appealing about the kind of Jewish evolution and Judaism's relationship to the state, and grafting that onto Islam and the Muslim experience, isn't there a risk that in some ways you might even some people might come out of your book and say, well, actually, this Judeo-Islamic tradition is pretty negative. It's actually frightening because it might mean that Muslims will lose some of their Sharia or their traditional relationship to their own law.
I think Muslims should lose some of their Sharia in the sense that I don't think there should be any apostasy laws, for example, which is historically considered as a part of the Sharia, which is you give that penalty for apostasy. I'm also a reformist when it comes to the Sharia anyway. So I think those blasphemy laws, apostasy laws, the interpretation of commending the right and forbidding the wrong as religious coercion, right? I mean, like enforcing hijab as it's happening, the headscarf as it's happening. I think we should lose those indeed. And do some Muslim majorities disagree with me on this? Yes, sure they do. And I'm not saying I follow the majority here. I follow what I think is the right thing to do. And these are new ideas for some Muslim societies. I mean, it was a new idea in Christianity when John Locke wrote a letter on toleration and saying that the state should not punish the heretical churches. And it was a new idea, but I think it was the right idea. So I do believe. Now, one good question is, when we get into this road of liberalism, let's say, will we end up becoming secular? And I'm making a distinction between these things. I'm making a distinction between secularity of the state and the secularity of the individual. I believe in a secular state, individuals and communities, voluntarily formed communities, can be very pious. Actually, I don't think there is a necessarily correlation. America has been a secular state from its very founding for over 2 centuries. It's been a very religious society.
Until recently. That's no longer the case.
Yeah, but I don't think that comes from the First Amendment, the founding of the America. I think that comes from other social dynamics. Maybe the mistakes of Christians and religious people themselves played a part of this. There is a progressive ideology that kind of defames religion or sees religion as always a negative force. I'm not with those forces, and I would like to preserve piety in society. I believe in its value. But that, just like in America, it was in America for a long time, that should be coming not from the state, but from the sincere belief and efforts of individuals and the communities that they form.
Okay. I'm going to break in here because you two are not going to be able to work out Islam and liberalism in the next 20 minutes. So I'm going to get my question in here for you, Mustafa. And it seems to me that one of the big underlying goals of this particular book around, the Judeo-Islamic tradition is clearly a desire for peace between Jews and Muslims. And it seems to me that your your strategy or your pathway to peace is by really emphasizing the similarities in theology and ethics and history, the sense of mutual influence and dependency, inspiring, a sense that we're actually siblings. We're not identical twins. I think one of the quotes goes, "We're fraternal twins, Jews and Muslims, children of Abraham."
Well, we're technically cousins.
Cousins,
And that's
right?
actually a very common phrase that's used in Arab countries, where Muslims will refer to Jews as their cousins. Unfortunately, it's not always said in the most positive way.
Yeah. So, but I think my question for you is, I've got to say, like, in my own life, some of my toughest fights are not with strangers or even friends, but with family members. And sibling fights can be some of the most painful ones. And, we talk a lot about pluralism and deep difference on this show and in this book we're working on. And I have to say that the very common argument that we need to focus on our commonalities in order to cultivate peace, it rings a little bit hollow to me. That if we focus on what we have in common, we will get along. Because so much fighting we see in right now, obviously in Gaza, is between siblings. And the fighting can be the nastiest amongst those who have similarities. And so I'm skeptical that this argument will cultivate peace between Jews and Muslims. The argument, hey, we actually have a lot in similar. Hey, we actually have a lot in common. So I'm wondering if you could speak to that skepticism, that commonality can breed, a level of peace.
First of all, in this book, I'm not trying to offer a solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, right? I'm not. I'm not saying this is how you should divide West Bank and Gaza and two-state solution, land swaps. I mean, people have been working on this for decades, and it hasn't worked well so far. Inshallah, I would hope to see some sort of a two-state solution. I'm not speaking about that. I'm speaking about the theological side of things. And I would argue that Islam and Judaism are the two religions which are less likely to have a theological war, a religious war. Islam is theologically at peace with Judaism, and Judaism is theologically at peace with Islam. Unlike in Christianity, they're not trying to convert each other. I mean, from an Islamic point of view, Jews are monotheists as well, and they have their Sharia. And yeah, if they convert, they're fine. There be some Islamic converts, but Islam and Christianity, they're both universalistic religions that actually try to convert each other. So there are some tensions there, and there's a tension over the nature of God questions. Islam and Judaism are theologically at peace, and I show that theological peace, at times, many times in history, also brought them together politically as well. Now, what is happening in the Holy Land between Israel and Palestinians since 1947, or it goes back to the Balfour Declaration? You can go back like 100 years before. That is a national conflict to me. It's like two peoples, Israelis and Palestinians, are claiming the same land, and they're fighting over that. We would have the same conflict if the Israelis happen to be Hindus and the Palestinians happen to be Buddhists. These are two people, two nations. Now, those nations, of course, have religious identities, and that those identities bring in other people to the fore. In Palestine, actually, we have Christian Palestinians too. That is not much noticed in America in a bizarre way. So I'm trying to de-religionize the conflict so it can be understood as what it is, which is a land dispute, basically, between two peoples. Now, I've seen these conflicts all over the Ottoman territories. In between Bulgaria and Greece and Serbia and of course, Bosnians, it was not a war over religion. It was a war over land and a nation state.
Yes, but it does seem that your particular book is trying to cultivate peace between Muslims and Jews. And one of the ways in which you do that is by emphasizing the similarities, right?
Emphasizing the similarities. And what I'm saying is that people have religionized the Israeli-Palestinian conflict on both sides. I oppose that. There emerge these Islamic narratives about that in the end of times, Jews will hide behind trees and Muslims will go after that, based on a illegit reported, let's say, saying attributed to Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. But how accurate they are, I also bring some doubt about that in the book. And on the Jewish side, of course, the Christian Zionists, so the whole idea, and I'm very disturbed by the term Amalek appearing in this conflict by some Israeli hawks to refer to the Palestinians, or at least to Hamas. So there is a religionization of the conflict. What I'm trying is to de-religionize the conflict, put it there as a dispute, just not too different from the war between the IRA and the British government, which was a Catholic Protestant war, but it was not a war over religion. It was a war over the control of a certain territory between two peoples.
A pointed question for you. Do you believe that the Jewish people are in any way special to God?
Good question. I think it's fair to say Abrahamic monotheism that we all come from was revealed first to the Jewish people. They spearheaded in history for a long time alone. So there's a special case with the Jewish people, which is acknowledged in the Quran. But I also believe that Abrahamic tradition had two major expansions. One is Christianity, one is Islam. So Jewish people brought it to the world. And so I don't think there is a special theological status for Jewish people today. We are all children of Abraham. Now, I'm not denying the same dignity or equality of non-Abrahamic peoples or stuff like that. But if you look at just from an Abrahamic theology, I think we've all become Israelites, right? We believe we worship the God of Abraham.
Yeah, so listeners will want to refer back to the debate Shadi and I just had about if we worship the same God.
Which we'll also include in the show notes. That was a good one. Matt, do you want to say a little bit more about where you were going with that question? I feel like there was something kind of underneath it that I'm intrigued by.
Well, there is something. There's a number of things underneath. I mean, for many Christians today, we will say that the Jewish people are in an important sense, God's chosen people and have a level of theological value. We're pretty vague and mysterious about what that exactly means, but there's a preciousness to God's people. So, like in my own family comes from the Netherlands, and obviously we were invaded by the Nazis, and many Jews within the Netherlands were killed, or in some cases they were hidden. And there were two groups of people in the Netherlands that hid a lot of Jews. One was the communists, and the other was the Calvinists, the Reform folks. And for the Calvinist Christians, they had this love of the Old Testament and appreciation for God's covenant with the Jewish people, and that inspired a number of them to protect the Jews. Out of this sense of the specialness of the Jews. But what this connects to for me, Shadi, is my earlier point about really emphasizing the similarities between Islam and Judaism out of a desire to cultivate peace. And the point I'm nervous about is kind of subtle, which is essentially like to say something like, Jews are worthy of protection and peace and respect because they're similar to us, or because we share a common tradition, or because our theology is quite similar, as opposed to an ethical argument that I think, like the Christian argument for religious freedom, or just freedom in general, is based upon all human beings are sacred. They are made in the image of God, and are valuable regardless of their theology, regardless of their history, regardless of their tradition, regardless of if they are children of Abraham or not. So that I have to respect people regardless of my sort of long tradition with them. And so I get worried when we're arguing for peace or whatever from the point of similarity, as opposed to grounding it in humanity. And this is where, Western liberalism, I would argue, emerged out of a Christendom type of assumption that human beings are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that all human beings, regardless of their tradition. So all being children of Abraham, that doesn't have an ethical meaning to me in this. Like, I want to treat Islamic citizens in the same way that I want to treat atheist citizens, because they're all children of God as opposed to children of Abraham. And sometimes with this Judeo-Christian thing or this Judeo-Islamic thing, I start to think, oh, we're creating levels of proximity that can bring trouble politically and so forth. So anyways, Mustafa, could you speak to that a little bit?
Sure. And I would agree with everything you just said, that human rights come from our belief that God has created all humans with equal dignity. And I certainly do not say the Jews and Muslims are on this good side and Christians too, maybe, and others are. I'm not saying that. Totally agree with you on that. That's why I call myself a liberal, right? I mean, I defend the rights of atheists and of any persuasion. But that's different from saying we have also a religious tradition which has incredible commonalities. Let's look at these things which will bring us more understanding. I mean, Christians and Jews are doing this, right? I mean, that's why we're speaking of a Judeo-Christian tradition. And as Shadi said in the beginning, this emerged in the 20th century. Until the 20th century, people were not speaking of a Judeo-Christian tradition. In Christianity, there were pretty negative views towards Jews, and among Jews too, Christianity was seen as a threat. And I mentioned some of the historical episodes that highlight that. But at some point, Christians began to say, instead of seeing Jews as Christ killers, they said, Christ was a Jew. Jesus was a Jew. Oh my God. So the Jewishness of Jesus became an emphasis. So in my book, what I try to do is that such a connection also exists between Judaism and Islam, sometimes even more powerful. Let's just look into this. Yes, there's a terrible national conflict in the Middle East, and because of course, holy places took a religious also color too, but that should not cloud our understanding. And in the book, I also remind that Muslims and Jews have similar religious freedom issues in Europe to get halal and kosher food, or to wear a kippah and a hijab. And so if we can somehow magically resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, actually Jews and Muslims have a whole world to discover together and to do many things together. With Christians too, and with others too, all children of God.
And I'll just add that Matt and I, and are pluralists in the sense that we value difference, and we're suspicious maybe of sameness, and especially the American tendency to want everyone to get along according to the same measures. So, but in our ideal world, we wouldn't be like that. But I think whether we like it or not, sort of emphasizing points of sameness does seem to be effective with people. Just as you brought up the Jewishness of Jesus, that made it emphasizing that made it easier for Christians to feel more comfortable with Jews. Maybe it shouldn't be that way, but that's the way it often turns out. So I think there's just simply a pragmatic argument here. Like, what is effective at persuading people to think differently about people they might otherwise be suspicious of? So, Matt, I mean, and this is maybe just like a little follow-up to Matt. I mean, how would you sort of respond to that? The idea that this is effective, even if it's not the way we want the world to be, this emphasis on similarity.
Yeah, I'm in favor of effectiveness. Whatever gets us to stop killing each other is great. But I'm concerned about the fragility of the case, because, if you're trying to ingratiate Muslims to me by, emphasizing all the things that Muslims and Christians have in common, you're creating a situation where the Muslim has to behave the way I want them to behave in order for peace to exist. So the Christian has to walk, talk, and act more Christian. The Muslim is forced to walk, talk, and act more Christianly in order for peace to exist, as opposed to cultivating within ourselves the ability to navigate these deep differences. And I think this comes out for me, Mustafa, just to turn our attention back to your really wonderful and interesting book, is the ways in which it seems to me you're emphasizing the commonalities between Islam and Judaism around, monotheism is a big one for you. Obviously, legalism, the focus on the law and obedience, and then liberty. So Moses for you is that figure, a liberator, right? He liberates the Israelites from slavery, and Islam also as a liberative force. And then reason. So you talk about the way that reason played a role in medieval Judaism and in medieval Islam. So we've got monotheism, legalism, reason, liberty, which I think you've found all of those in Islam and Judaism in your research. But it does feel a little bit like, after reading that, I'm like, this all sounds a lot like Mustafa. in that it does feel a little bit like you're creating a Judeo-Islamic tradition that sounds a lot like the things that you care about, which is liberty and reason and monotheism and law. And so I'm wondering how much are you projecting into history a liberalism that might not be in Moses, or in the Jewish Moses, or in the Islamic Moses, and so forth.
Very good question, Matt. Among those four things you emphasize, I think everybody, including the most conservative Muslims and the ultra-Orthodox Jews, would agree on two things. Monotheism and law are fundamental to these two religions, right? So I think that's a very important fact.
You're on solid ground.
I'm solid ground there. Well, by the way, I'm also interested in liberalism. And how did Judaism look into liberalism? Did it help Judaism? How were they before liberalism? How did they come up to terms? Did it help them? Did it, for example, help Jews to stop demonizing each other because of their religious differences? And some are Reform, some are conservative, some are ultra-Orthodox. How can they all get along well? Maybe not. Maybe they're not always in love with each other, but they don't have blasphemy or heresy courts. That's great. Well, how did that happen? So, or also there are Jews that are non-practicing, which are not necessarily coerced and demonized and so on and so forth. Well, some forces in Israel may be going back to that direction, by the way. Let's also bring that. Now, Judaism has its own state for the first time, and it's having interesting impacts there, which is another discussion. But I think the Jewish experience in the West is, to me, interesting as someone who also believes that the Islamic civilization should take a more liberal direction. Liberal, again, in the sense of toleration, non-coercion, and religion based on voluntary choices and not impositions. So there is a ground there which is factual. On top of it, yes, I'm studying Moses Mendelssohn, and because he's the liberal pioneer.
So let me pick up on one piece of, we'll call it Jewish strangeness that doesn't show up in the book, out of this desire to, focus on commonality, which is, in the first 5 books of the Bible for the early Israelites, the practice of sacrifice for the atonement of sins is a really important thing for the
Judaism
Israelite,
and Christianity.
And Christianity, the atonement of sins. That's a big deal. And that kind of gets left out in your book, right? It's monotheism
yeah.
and law.
Yeah.
And so the shedding of blood, the renewal of the covenant, the forgiveness of sins and atonement gets left out in your book. And, I think, of course, if you were to have a chapter on that, that would slow you down and it would confuse the argument. And I understand why, as an author, you would leave that out. But I think that highlights for me one of the problems that I have with modernity, with liberalism, with the desire for unity, is what can happen is we start to take out the parts of religion that feel strange, that feel weird, that don't fit in with the modern world. And ancient Israel, they're killing cows and blood is going everywhere, and it's messy and it's smelly and there's fire. And it's a weird part of ancient Israel, but it's critical to who they understand themselves to be, even today. And it's a critical part of the Christian tradition as well. But you left it out of the book for reasons that I understand, but I see this as something that happens within modernity all the time, is the weirdness of religion. It makes us uncomfortable in the public square, so we make it smooth. And I think of the hijab as this like wonderful example. It's a strange, awkward thing that doesn't fit. And in modernity, it seems like we want to get rid of it. Well, I don't want to get confused with the hijab, but like this thing of, for Moses in the Bible, atonement rituals are really critical, central to how we relate to God. So.
Such a great Christian question, because I know how important it is for Christian
the
theology.
Christians
too.
are going to talk about blood. Right?
Yeah. By the way, it's only us Muslims who are doing those sacrifices today every Eid al-Adha, right? I mean, not burning them, but sacrificing an animal like in the path of Abraham. So that's a very Islamic thing to do. Now, there are things that are theologically important for Judaism and Christianity, but Islam didn't continue them. The idea of a sacrifice is there in Islam, but not as an atonement. Another one, Sabbath. I mean, we don't have a day of Sabbath in Islam. We're proud that we can even work on Friday too. It's just that you should go to a mosque, but then actually the Quran says then go out and do shopping and buying and selling, let's say. So there are differences, yes. I mean, I emphasize commonalities. Yes, true, because I'm speaking of a Judeo-Islamic tradition here. And I'm trying to go against the tide here among Jews. Probably there are people who would not want any association with Islam, and there are many Muslims who would not want any association with Judaism. Sayyid Qutb has this book, Our War with the Jew, like beginning from Mecca to today. Well, that's not the way I see things. And I see people tweeting online saying that Islam has oppressed us for 1,400 years. Well, that's not the truth as I see it. So I'm emphasizing certain things here. But on the strangeness of religion, please do not mistake me for a French secularist or someone who wants to take hijab off from Muslim women or even want to promote that. I'm all for the strangeness of religion. I'm all for the assertion of a truth. I'm all for walking out in the public square and saying, you're all sinners and you're going to burn in hell and the truth is here, the end is near. I love that. I love that assertion of religion. I might not agree that. I agree with the self-confidence and and the sincerity of that belief. Well, I would not like that if that guy also had a sword or a lash or, just coming after you. So I love Muslim women wearing hijab. My mom in her youth did, then later she didn't. That's fine. My grandmom certainly did. I'm against hijab laws. I love the Ramadan. I'm against Ramadan laws, which we have in some Muslim majority societies, because I think that takes the sincerity, the piety, the genuineness of religion. So again, I'm not arguing for let's all be secular, liberal people who do yoga and this and that, and maybe not go to the mosque or once a year or something, and nobody should wear hijab, or hijab should be a fashion statement. I'm not promoting those things. What I'm promoting is that be religious, be proud of it, be assertive, but do not do unethical things in the name of religion. That happens. That's violence, that's coercion, that is extremism.
But there still is that risk, Mustafa, that once you go down this path of liberalization, even if it's not the intent, it can end up in a very secular place. And
then you deserve it. I mean, then a tradition deserves it.
I like this.
If a tradition cannot sustain itself without coercion, then it deserves to.
Oof.
Okay, but I'm not so much talking about coercion here as much as, I mean,
It's a free market of religions and non-religious worldviews.
But it's not just a choice between liberalism and coercion. I think sometimes I get the sense that, like, you're presenting that as a binary choice. There are a lot of shades in between liberalism as a choice and the kind of coercive models that you've been mentioning in Muslim majority countries where laws are used in a very punitive way by the state. Presumably there's something in between that.
Yeah, of course there's something in between. Yeah, I said Turkey is not bad as a model, or there are other Muslim societies where you don't have Sharia in the legal system, but the society is pretty conservative in many ways, and that's totally fine. And I'm in favor of that. I mean, I'll give you actually one thing. I've been always fascinated by the fact that in New York, which is the city of Sex and the City, right? I mean, the modern citadel of vices. And there is this amazing ultra-Orthodox community who doesn't care about any of that, but preserves itself in Brooklyn and sustains itself. I have great respect to those people. I don't know their political views on certain things these days, but I have great respect for those people that they live in the center of the modern world. You can get as free as you want. That's America. You can go, but they preserve their religious tradition. There are many Muslims like that too. I have great respect to them. But if they establish a halakhic state, that would not be a good thing.
Would you be in favor of like pluralistic forms of law where you could get an Islamic marriage or a Catholic marriage or a Jewish marriage that would be sort of backed up by the state in some sort of way?
Yeah, I'm in favor. I mean, I'm sympathetic to the Sharia courts in the UK.
Okay.
Because that's voluntarily observed. And as I also
that's
mentioned
not a very
in the book,
liberal thing. That's not a very liberal
that's
thing.
a very liberal thing because they're going to the Sharia court out of their choice, right? It's not the state is imposing them on that part.
But there is still a kind of communal pressure when you have courts like that.
That's fine.
Because if there's an expectation in your community that
that's
you would
to me, that's very compatible with my liberalism, right?
Yeah.
I'm happy that some British Muslims go to Sharia courts and they think that that's the right thing to do, and very happy for them. A lot of British Muslims don't because they're less observant and less traditional.
But what if they feel pressure to and they're not actually taking part voluntarily?
Well, that depends on the nature of the pressure there, right? I mean, if pressure means social expectations and approval and disapproval, that's totally normal. It happens in every society. And there are secular expectations from people too today, right? I mean, oh, you shouldn't say that word and that's inappropriate or so on and so forth. So those pressures are normal. And it organically happens. If it is a violent coercion, it's about enforcement. So I have a problem with that.
Yeah, the last thing I want to end on is just to go back to this, I think, kind of profound point that you made, Mustafa, that if a religious tradition can't sustain itself in the face of liberalism, then they get what they deserve. I think another way of looking at it is to say that liberalism is so powerful, it's so ideologically resonant. Even if we don't really see it as an ideology, there is it's in the air that we breathe. It kind of seeps into us even when we don't realize it. And part of that is because it's an ideology that oftentimes claims to be neutral. So it's able to play on both levels quite effectively. It kind of lulls you into this sense of complacency, and before you know it, you're transformed. And yeah, maybe we get what we deserve. And if religions can't resist the pull of liberalism, then that's the free market. Whoever wins in the end, they win. And if liberalism wins, all the better. But another way of looking at it is to acknowledge that because liberalism is so powerful and so influential, like in this almost like psychological social sense, that we have to preemptively put up guardrails. We have to put protections against this deep appeal that liberalism has, especially if if you're trying, I hear this a lot from observant Muslims who are trying to you've probably heard of these examples of people, in some cases even leaving the US to kind of form intentional Muslim communities, including in Istanbul. I think we've talked about an example of a mutual friend who actually exited the US and tried and is trying to build this alternative, lifestyle in Istanbul. But that it's just very hard to build intentional communities even in the US. Let's say the ultra Orthodox in New York. There's various intentional Muslim communities that have sprouted up throughout the US, but it's very hard. It's very hard to do that effectively because of the power of liberalism around you. It's almost like an uphill battle, and sometimes it's a losing battle. And I'm sure you've heard a lot of these concerns from people who are trying to raise their kids in a more religiously observant environment. And then we get into the whole debate about public schools in various parts of America that are promoting a certain conception of the self when it comes to gender and those sorts of things. How do you resist that? So I would just say, how maybe just end with a reflection on that. If liberalism is so powerful, maybe it's not okay to just say, well, we got to let things play out. And then maybe we have to act. Maybe these people want to fight liberalism in a more active way. What would you say to them?
Shadi, this is so helpful to me because I'm realizing that when we discuss about liberalism, we've been speaking about different things all along. I mean,
no, but just to clarify, I'm talking about what liberalism becomes over time. Because
no, you're speaking about a lifestyle here, a worldview, what anything goes, do whatever you want, find yourself, enjoy, libertinism almost I'm speaking of a political system of a limited neutral government, right? I mean, under which people can be conservative, pious,
right, but that's an idealization. I get that. That's what you're.
I'm just saying. Okay, you might say this is also liberalism. That's also liberalism. There are endless discussions about that, and I know Patrick Deneen makes the argument that this actually came from that. I mean, you end up wokeism beginning with John Locke, so I know that argument, but I don't fully agree with that. There are other people I think who do not agree. I know many conservative Christians in America who want a very limited state, so they are classical liberals, but they're not buying into what you're describing. Here's the thing. First of all, there is a challenge. Now I'm living in America. I see that more clearly. Of being a religious minority in a majority society, but this society is not from your religion. Like if I was raising my kids in Turkey, they would hear the adhan, the call to prayer 5 times a day. Here they don't. So there's a challenge to that. But that's a minority issue. Regarding this attractiveness of this modern world, I mean, I would call that secularization. I would not call that liberalism, like secularization of the society. Is that a drive? Yeah, there's everything out there, right? I mean, there is all the vices, there's all the drives and all that. I would defend liberalism, by the way, though, there, against what you just mentioned as these coercive things in the schools. Enforced progressivism monkeys. I don't see that liberalism, by the way. I should say that. That is, I think, coercive progressivism that goes against classical liberalism as they understand it as state neutrality. Regarding this modern world and its attractions, well, that is a challenge. But what is the solution that you find? Well, Iran found a solution. Ban all the websites that you can and force people to behave a certain way. It actually produced more secularization. What I'm saying is that this is a challenge. You cannot reverse it. You cannot go back to medieval times where people lived in close communities. In this modern world, how do you survive, sustain, and flourish as a religious community? I think the Jewish tradition has good answers. I mean, look at all the Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox communities around the U.S.
But they're a very small minority.
I'm sympathetic to the Reform Jews, too. Actually, there's a discussion about Reform Judaism in the book, too. Because actually, Reform Judaism has kept many Jews who would otherwise not be interested in religion still in a religious spiritual framework. Maybe that is something what you need. Maybe you need different versions of your religion so you can cover a bigger audience there, right? Some people would be happier there and there. So, I mean, modernization is a challenge, but I think the right answer is not challenging liberalism, therefore asking for going towards integralism, as people like Adrian Vermeule and some Christian integralists are saying. I think it's important to not allow secular progressivism seep in as the new state ideology, so that and trampling on people's rights. There, I am a liberal, and that's why I'm opposing that. So again, here's a complicated terminology here, there, but I think this is a new challenge. By the way, it's a new challenge for old religious traditions. 1,000 years ago, everybody had communities. Nobody had internet. There was no Richard Dawkins books spreading around and so on and so forth. Now you have these things. What do you do with this? And I think it requires a new effort, which by definition must be a modern effort. And the pre-modern ways of sustaining your society might not work.
Mustafa, thank you so much for being with us. I have like 10 more questions for you, but...
Yeah, honestly, like this was incredible. It's just so rich. Thank you, Mustafa.
Thank you. Yeah.
We're going to have you back. I want to just commend you for being a stand-up guy with, throwing up some tough questions for you. I want to commend you for this book. I really do mean it when I say this is a needed book. This is a new and fresh argument. It is stunning to me after having read it that there's not more attention paid to the Judeo-Islamic tradition.
And now hopefully there will be.
Yeah, and I think just finally, Mustafa, you are a man of principle. You're a man of courage. And you speak out of those principles in a really wonderful way. And I'm confident that you have gotten a lot of hate mail in your life from a variety of
even more than
angles.
That. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, and I just want to commend you for. I mean, it is clear that your scholarship comes out of a sense of mission and a sense of principle, and you have some goals that are important to you, and you're sticking to them. And I just really appreciated what you had to say today, and I hope we can get you back on because this was a lot of fun, man.
Thank you. Yeah.
And I also like ending the episode on just like honoring Mustafa and just like saying nice things about him for several minutes. So that's a good way of ending, and well deserved.
I'm humble enough, thank you. But thank you, Beth, and thank you, Shadi.
Absolutely. We've had a Catholic socialist on the show, and now we've had a Muslim libertarian. I just love this show. This is so much fun.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a big fan anyway, and I'll be more so even from now on. But thank you guys. This was wonderful, and thank you for paying attention to the book, and really also thank you for the soft questions and the hard questions, which were all great. Even the second ones are even better. So
that's what we do here at Zealots at the gate.
Yeah. You just lure them in, and then you just give them hell. Right? I'm kidding.
No. Well, thanks again, Mustafa, and thanks to our listeners. Hope you enjoyed this episode as much as we did. Just a reminder: do check out Mustafa's book, The Islamic Moses. Again, we'll include a link in the show notes. If you like what you heard, do check out our other episodes, and also check out our host, Comment Magazine, at comment.org. And we want to hear from you. Find us on Twitter at Shadi Hamid, that's my handle, and at Matthew Kaming, please note the Dutch spelling, or you can use the hashtag ZealotsPod. You can also feel free to send us an email at zealots@comment.org.
Our thanks as well to Fuller Seminary's Mao Institute of Faith and Public Life for sponsoring the show. Zealots at the Gate is hosted by Comment Magazine, produced by Ali Crummy, audience strategy by Matt Crummy, and editorial direction by Miss Ann Snyder. Until next time, guys, I'm Matthew Kaming.
And I'm Shadi Hamid. Thanks for joining us.
See ya.